Ken Cooper, thank you for spending time with us this morning talking about the Litton case and other cases.
My pleasure, David.
But before we begin, I'd like to share some information about this series with our audience. We're about to hear from Ken Cooper and some of the work that he's done over the past 40 years in system dynamics. Over the past 40 years, Ken Cooper has modeled over 300 projects with a total value of $250 billion. That's a trillion with a T. And this has been in shipbuilding, including destroyers, cruisers, assault craft, aircraft carriers, aerospace, the B-2 bomber craft, missiles, radar systems, automotive with several new car developments, as well as construction, including huge projects like the Channel Tunnel. Ken in his career has been involved in dozens of disputes and hundreds of projects that involve proactive management as opposed to dispute management. This all started with the Litton shipbuilding case, which we're going to hear about in just a couple of minutes. And over the past 40 years, Ken has worked with senior executives in Hughes Aircraft, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Jaguar Cars, Fluor Corporation, and many more. In those 40 years, project modeling has become one of, if not the most important and studied practice areas in the field of system dynamics, in a large part because of the large benefits that this work has brought to clients. What also came was a good reputation for system dynamics in the corporate world, in government and legal arenas, as well as global recognition for project modeling within the management science field. So I'm very pleased to welcome Ken Cooper, and starting this off with a chat about the Litton Industries case, the first.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Glad to offer some stories about the origins of some of the work that I think is fairly widespread at this point. As you said, David, the start of all of the project modeling work was indeed the Litton work. It is a shipyard, or was a shipyard at the time, owned by Litton, taken over by from the Ingalls family, and still is known as the Ingalls Shipyard. But at the time, the shipyard was predominantly doing work for the U.S. Navy, as indeed it still is. The two programs that dominated the shipyard at the time in the 1970s were first a program called the LHA program, which is a helicopter assault ship, something of a small aircraft carrier. And when I say small, I mean it was only 20 stories tall and the length of 3 football fields. And a class of 30 destroyers, the Spruance class of destroyers. And between them, there were billions of dollars involved, and Ingalls, or Litton, had the responsibility to both design and build all of the ships. Now, the Defense Department goes through cycles in the style of procurement that it employs. And at the time that these were contracted, they used a form of contracting called total package procurement. And what that was supposed to mean is that the contractor, Ingalls or Litton, had the responsibility for doing everything, for designing the ships to the specs that the Navy provided, and procuring the materiel, building the ships and getting them into active service in the Navy. Didn't work out exactly the way it was planned, obviously. There turned out to be large numbers of design changes that occurred that were requested or demanded by the Navy. And of course, the arguments may linger to this day as to who was responsible for which changes, but nevertheless, facing the prospect of a cost overrun on the programs that was clearly going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the question became the degree of responsibility that the two parties had in that cost overrun. And what it boiled down to was essentially who was going to write whom a check and for how much. The use, something better than the often fuzzy-minded and sometimes self-serving techniques that were used to quantify these impacts on programs. Something better than that was needed, and the Ingalls turned to system dynamics, and there's a little bit of a backstory there, and perhaps we can talk about that a bit later. But suffice it to say, we got involved with this work, and very quickly became clear that something that had never been done before, the use of a simulation model to quantify the damages on one of these program cost overrun cases. But the method that we decided to employ, which now in retrospect seems obvious, was novel at the time, was to design and build the model and validate it and set it up so that the model simulates very accurately the known history of the programs, and then employ the model for one big key what-if question, and that is, and this is the key one for the whole case and cases like it, what would have been the costs on the program but for the specific changes that were cited by Ingalls in its claim. And aside from issues of legal entitlement and such, the big unknown for going into that work was the degree of secondary impact of those changes. And it goes by a lot of different names, and those of you who have been in that world will have heard it referred to as ripple effects or disruption. The folks at Ingalls had a more colorful few names for it, one of which that I can say out loud is death by 1,000 cuts. Lots and lots and lots of changes, some of them small, but many of them. So this was a model that when we built it, we had at its core a structure that was the first design. I remember doing the drawings of the Rework Cycle, although the name, the Rework Cycle, came several years later, and perhaps we'll have a chance to talk about that in on another case. But the first job in carrying out one of these analyses in support of a dispute, the first job of the analyst is to quantify and explain the causes of the cost growth. The second job is to be able to convince the listener, the fact finder, the other side of the correctness of the analysis. And if you think about, just pause to think about what the level of scrutiny would be and the degree of proof required when you're asking another party, in this case, for a $500 million check. This was a case that was after months of discussion and back and forth, after the modeling work had been completed and reviewed by dozens of other analysts. There came to a point where there was a very favorable resolution. Ingalls received the vast majority of the amounts that they were seeking. It was a quantification that was entirely based on the system dynamics modeling of the programs. In addition to a really groundbreaking quantification and settlement, it allowed the Navy and Ingalls to move out of the adversarial positions that they had because the claim and the dispute process went on for years. as some of these large cases do. But what we did not know at the time was that the impact of that work was going to end up extending far beyond those first shipbuilding programs and that one dispute, and move into other companies and industries around the world.
So kind of one follow-up, about how much was that project worth to Litton?
The settlement was for about $400 million.
$400 million.
Right.
Thank you, Ken. Sometime I hope we have a chance to get into that backstory.
Well, happy to.
And thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you more about some of your other projects.
Pleasure.
Thank you.